This week here on Mastering Dungeons, we are going to continue our look at Greyhawk, whether it's the Living Greyhawk campaign or the history of that setting or the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer. We have you covered. And we have covered a lot of those topics. We have just started our look at the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer, and we got to the point where we were at chapter 4, which is the full Gazetteer of the Fleneus. So this is what looks at the entire. That's right. Teos is holding up the wonderful Living Greyhawk Gazetteer, published in around 2000. And we are going to now go into this chapter and do a little bit of a dive into regions. And as we've mentioned at the start of most of our episodes about Greyhawk, what we're looking at is both the content of it. What is Greyhawk? How is it as a setting? What does it represent? But also sort of look at world building for role-playing games as a holistic topic, and show what might be important for players and game masters to know, what might not be, what's the best way to present a setting and a world to get the most use out of it for the most economical presentation, we'll say.
Yeah, somehow this has to be all distilled into a DMG. It's not going to all fit. So what do you do? And yeah, what does it tell us about this setting book written in 2000, the way it kind of came to be, right? Their answer was to take the shorter version in the original box set and kind of pump it out, reflecting both the things that had happened in products over the time and just expand upon all of it with the knowledge and additional creations that they wanted to see in it.
Yeah. As I was reading over this Gazetteer, I kept thinking more and more and more and more about the different types of products that you might sell or might desire as a consumer to run your game, to entertain yourself, and the differences between them and the differences between what people want. And we talked about in the news section about this sort of digital revolution. And as I was reading this is sort of where I feel good about digital versus print, in that you can, as a company, realize that you have a segmented audience, and you can give in a more expensive print product, more expensive to make and more expensive to buy. You can give a section that covers the most that people want, and then you can use digital to supplement that.
True.
To give content that not everyone wants, but some people want. So Wizards doesn't need to make a 500-page setting guide. If they can make a 150-page one that really serves the most people, then that 350 pages can be put elsewhere, and people who really want it can access it.
Yeah, though I worry about where we are currently in that, for example, this Planescape, we saw that there was an expansion to cover one of the factions in Planescape and provide us an online purchasable piece that told us all about this faction. And at least when I talked to folks, they were thinking, well, maybe we'll make more. And they didn't, right? But also it's very easy to forget it because it's this digital only offering. And where does it exist? Well, on your D&D Beyond account somewhere. And it's really easy to lose it, right? For example, Spelljammer had that academy that then you couldn't find anymore. Like you had either gotten it for free when it came out, but after that you couldn't even buy it. So it's so easy to lose everything, not only because the platform can shift, but the platform can even exist and it can be, something you don't find. I almost feel like if it doesn't exist in print, it doesn't exist. And that's obviously not true, right? But it can, the way companies have trouble managing information, it really can be true.
It can be true. And I agree with you. The first part, I would say, but if you forget that it exists, there's a good chance that you really didn't want it in the first place
Mm.
or didn't need it. And so I think there is a balance there, and it's going to be different for every
Yeah.
person. It's going to be different for every company. But for me, this is where the Living Greyhawk thing idea can flourish.
Mm.
One of the avenues, and we talked about this in our question and answer section, one of the avenues to capture that is to tap people who can, or companies or individuals who can uh,
Flesh it out.
enhance,
Mm.
enhance it, whether it's through a D&D Beyond, whether it's
Yeah.
through a DM's Guild / Drive Through RPG, whether it's through something that hasn't even been created yet,
Mm. Yeah, that'd be
and
cool.
give that content that would not be profitable to publish in one way,
Right.
might be
Yeah.
profitable for other people in a different way.
Yeah, I could see that. Um, well, like you have been thinking about settings, and I think folks in our Discord have as well. And one of the things that came up on the Patreon Discord was, Tal'Darai, both
Mhm.
the reborn version and the original Green Ronin version, does a really nice job of taking a kind of typical setting, right? Like it starts with like the world and the gods and the creation and very like, yeah, okay, like all setting books. But one of the things it does really well, and fourth edition did this as well with Forgotten Realms, is it'll have for the various sections, it'll have all the kind of information you find in the book we're about to cover, but then it has these, and here are the hooks, and it very
Mhm.
explicitly kind of breaks out the hooks by mid-level or high level, sort of things that you can deal with and want to, rumors about this and here's what's going on, and open-ended, right? So it's a thing that sends you off towards doing this kind of in investigations, and as a DM to go like, ooh, yeah, I want to do something with that. That's cool. Yeah, so I thought that was a neat kind of, have settings evolved? Yes, sometimes, right? Like there are some innovations that we've seen in various products, even if many of them still resemble what we've got here in our hands.
For sure. So the chapter begins with some general information, and some of it's hilarious. There's this one part that's like, everything that you read here might or might not be true. And
Right.
and yeah, I mean, it's funny to read that, especially if you are the type of person for whom canon is so important that any deviation from it absolutely ruins your sense of fun. Although sometimes I wonder if the people who are so steeped in canon even play. Uh, and that's another audience consideration, is people who are reading this more to create stories for themselves than creating narratives that they shepherd players through and make it a group effort. Um, but we get that. Don't
Yeah.
believe everything here that you read. And then we are not going to include the following things in this chapter.
Yeah.
And then they tell you in vast detail about the things that they are not
Not
including.
going to include.
And
I
then give
laughed at
you
that.
examples about things that they're not including. And then if you go and read some of the regional entries, they absolutely tell you
Yeah.
about the things that they said they weren't going to tell you about in the chapter.
It's an
So
entire page on
it's
what they're
sort
not
of
going to
funny.
cover. It's so funny.
Right.
And yeah, as you said it, then they do cover them. It's funny. Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing about that is a lot of the things that they talk about not covering are the things that are most interesting as adventures.
Yes. That's
Right.
one thing where I'd give the edge to the Forgotten Realms, right? So they say things like, we're not going to cover the infamous Vault of the Drow, a cavern under the Hell Furnaces, or the Mind Flayer, blah, blah, blah. Which, if you look at like, especially the fourth edition material, but also earlier editions of Forgotten Realms, it tells you like, here are the major enemy monstrous groups and what they're doing. This does not focus on that, right? Even though it may mention them at times, it doesn't focus on that. And they're in the adventure. It's what makes all the adventures sing, which is kind of funny. But yeah, they don't cover that.
But then we finally get to what they will cover for each region. And we get basically bullets or subsections that they're
Mhm.
going to talk about the names, the rulers, the government, capital, the major towns, the provinces, resources, coinage, population, languages, alignments, religions, allies, enemies, overview, history, and then conflicts and intrigues. And
And most of this is small, right?
mhm,
It's also very, like we've talked about before, it's very encyclopedic. It's very like a
mhm,
product of its time. Um, but some of it are things that we've abandoned and I think lost a bit, right? Like, I mean, it's funny that they give like so many kingdoms have like, okay, in Ahlissa, which we'll talk about first, the Nightingale is the platinum piece and the crown and so you can
mhm,
some of the things nice flavor you can throw into what the coins are, and so that these coins came from Alyssa instead of some neighboring land. um the population of all these towns, like someone put in so much work into all of this. The different resources, it's like we're doing a trading game or one of those old maps you might have had in old books that show farm goods come from this country and steel from here, and it's that kind of stuff. But things like religion, and I remark on this kind of later when I was looking at one of the kingdoms, but religion is a huge part of Greyhawk, right? And
mhm,
and this is it mattered in play, it mattered in third edition, it mattered in Living Greyhawk. Like different regions follow different deities, and that
mhm.
matters. That's a source of conflict, right? So we get and of course things like allies and enemies and so on. But it is really interesting, right? This stuff is part of Greyhawk's instability and powder keg status.
Yeah. And what I started thinking about when I read this section and they covered what they were going to cover is there a difference between a gazetteer and a campaign guide
Hmm.
and a world Bible
Hmm.
and a story Bible? And can we qualify or quantify what those differences are? And can we predict what an audience of a different variety might want? Is there something that everyone wants?
Huh. Yeah.
And can we drill down and get that, leaving some of the less desired content, not unimportant,
Right.
but less desired by the
Yeah.
audience
And less useful.
content aside? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what you say about like the coin names is super cogent because right in my campaign, this is going to take place in two regions. It's going to take place in Keoland and Jeff, and they're going to travel back and forth between the two. So I really want when they travel from Jeff to Keoland and they have coins that they got in Jeff, and the people in Keoland they go to the town square and they buy food. Is the person who's serving them going to look at this coin and accept it heartily?
Yeah.
Are they
Right.
going to look at it suspiciously? Are they going to toss it away and say, "Sorry, give me real money"? Right.
Yeah.
That can be great role playing fun
Mm-hmm. A few times.
for a few times.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, for someone else who doesn't care, how much space are they willing to
Mm-hmm.
relinquish in a book before they say, "We don't want this"?
Right.
And so it's that sort of question that I'm grappling with, and I don't have any answers to, or at
Yeah.
least I recognize a multitude of possible answers as I try to come up with this one true way
Yeah.
to make the product that
Yeah.
everyone will want and
Well,
enjoy.
and like alignment is here, right? The
Yeah.
alignments listed in their order of, prevalence, I think it probably is, or maybe that's a good question. Is it in an order?
Because I know that there's an asterisk. They list all the alignments that quote unquote you will find, but then they put an asterisk next to the alignment of the government and or the police or power groups that
Yeah.
keep control of the region.
Yeah.
And they actually say, lawful means this and chaotic means this and good means this and evil means this. And if you go strictly by um,
Yeah.
by their uh, restrictions or alignment clarifications. Basically, every government is lawful evil.
Kind of. But I
Right.
think so. Looking at two nations, it really does look like they've sorted it in order. So, like,
Right.
Alyssa's most common alignment is neutral, then neutral evil, then lawful evil. That gets the asterisk because it's how laws are administered. And if you go to
Right.
Bandit Kingdoms, it's chaotic neutral, chaotic evil. That's how the laws are administered. Neutral evil, neutral. So, so there's a different mix. And that is informative from the perspective of those folks. Whereas a lot of people today, I think, would look at this and go, what's happening here? And what? Alignment?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. Well, that's sort of me.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm not a huge fan of alignment as a very kludgy way to try to take a very complicated system and make it understandable.
I both
Uh,
agree and miss it, but
yeah. Well, I mean, you can miss it. And I never, even back when,
yeah.
I saw all the arguments about
Yeah.
what exactly chaotic neutral meant, including fistfights at the table over it, and realized this isn't part of the game I really care about. Uh,
Yeah. My
but
favorite is
yeah,
always the folks who wanted to cast blasphemy, and someone goes, "Well, that'll hurt me." And like, could you change your alignment just for a moment? Nothing in the
right.
rule
Just
says you
change.
can't.
Exactly. Exactly. So, so
Hmm.
all of these categories are there.
Yeah.
And as Teo said, most of them are just a brief line. So population, it will give you the species slash racial makeup of a region just on a few lines. Languages will tell you which languages are most spoken there.
Hmm.
Uh, Enemies and allies will give you just who a nation is allied with or tensions or outright warfare with. And then the overview is generally longer, but not long. And then the history section will go on forever. And then the conflict and intrigue section will be the shortest
Paragraph.
of
Yeah.
paragraphs. And I'm going to talk about that when we talk about the different regions as well.
Yeah, and the
Uh,
whole length varies by places. Some of them are 2 pages, some of them are 5 or 6, and Bandit Kingdoms is really big. Bissell is just 2 pages, right? So it really varies by region how much they felt they should add for it. And sometimes they do things like Alyssa, they name out the principalities and who the leader of each one is. That's getting cut, but they feel the need to do so too. Periodically, you get art. Like for Alyssa, you get this, the Overking. And what's
mhm,
great about this art that I'm holding up for folks who can see it is that it shows you the Overking being posing with a scepter and kind of the world in the palm of their hand or something like that. And then there is a mirror, a shield at his feet. And in the shield is reflected the painter with a dagger to their neck as one of the guards of the
mhm.
palace is having them do this portrait correctly.
Yes.
And that tells you a lot
Yeah.
about. So sometimes this art is actually really illustrative. It's often points in a particular conflict or something like that, but it can be very
Right.
informative. Great stuff.
Yeah. So let's dig into Alyssa first, and let's go through it in a bit of detail just so we can show it's a good example, I think,
Hmm.
of a
Hmm.
relatively large region that gets a good amount of content. And we can talk about again how it is presented, what information is given,
Yeah, and
and
can I say,
how it is. Yeah, go ahead.
folks who are listening along may enjoy going to greyhawkonline.com, a website by cartographer, amongst many other things, Anne B. Meyer. And Anne
Mhm.
does these amazing Greyhawk maps that you can zoom in on it and see where everything is because it's kind of helpful to see these when you look at the map and you realize the mountains, the forests, the rivers, the lakes, and that also adds to this understanding of each of these nations or regions.
Mhm.
So I highly recommend doing that. I found myself doing that when I was talking about these regions to be like, wait, where is this and who's it adjacent to? Oh, that matters. That's why they're
Mhm.
this way, and kind of shapes
Yeah,
their history and all that.
Anna's maps are awesome and incredible, and as a just like a resource out there for you, um, you should definitely check it out. So as I do that as well, we will jump into Alyssa and its content. So the proper name is United Kingdom of Alyssa, which to me draws, United Kingdom parallels, whether rightly or wrongly. We get the ruler, whose name is Zavener the First, His Transcendent Imperial Majesty.
Wow.
And the other thing we get all the other titles, uh, but we get a little brief uh, alignment, human, male, rogue 15. So we get a level and a class for each of those people, which to me is hilarious. And it shows this need of gamers, maybe, to quantify and qualify everything. Uh, and is that useful to you? Understanding this is third edition, understanding this is.
Well, so there's two answers to that. One is, what would I put in a DMG, and what is useful to me as an overall setting?
Mhm.
I think that all these things, I maybe because I've grew up with this sort of thing, I make use of these, and I actually found myself over the years surprised by how all of these things could shape my understanding of these and become tools for telling the stories behind them. But that said, I think you can save a lot of space and just have, like, if we go to something like Fate's Aspects, right, which we often talk
Mhm.
about, that can be a more powerful vehicle for storytelling if we see that as the point rather than achieving the truth, right? So, like, I think a question a designer can ask themselves in this day and age is my job to portray Greyhawk in a true way so that every individual table out there can experience the true Greyhawk? Or am I
Mhm.
helping you tell stories?
Yeah.
And those are two entirely different products,
Mhm.
right? If the DMG wants to say, hey, you know, uh, a overly powerful, cruel leader enforcing the law because this, that, and the other, right? The real summary top lines, and
Mhm.
you go at it, right? You do with that what you want, but then you miss those nuances, so that when you describe your Alyssa to some other DM, they go, oh, "Mine's totally different." I mean, yeah, I have that, wild ruler, but that's because of this. My whole other reason that I came up with because I didn't have all the other information that was in the old book, right?
Mhm.
I don't know. What do you think?
It makes me question if D&D is a political game or a fantasy storytelling sword and sorcery
Uh
game.
huh.
Uh, because when I see a class and a level given for these these rulers, I recognize the fact that you don't want, as a game master and a storyteller, for the
Yeah.
characters to walk in and shoot the
Yes.
commoner and do 6 points of damage with your uh crossbow bolt
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the leader's dead. But this idea of Rogue 15,
Yes, it's too much. I know. I agree.
yeah.
I do agree with you. It is overall not. I wouldn't do it, right? Because I think we live in a different place today, and it can only be used against you. It's like either they're low level, and okay, so this means they can't touch them, or now the characters can totally take over this guy, but you didn't want any of that to begin with, right? We want a different way to portray your leader. And I mean, it's always funny when the leader of a place is a rogue. You go, wait, that does tell me something, right? But I think you can achieve
Yeah.
that in better ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And but it brings to the question the
Yeah.
entire game system, in that how do you handle something? Why are you presenting this leader if the characters are not supposed to interact with them in any sort of way? And
Hmm.
I talk to my class when we talk about world building, Yeah, I say pretend we're making a game where it's your life. And we've done stats and we've done ways to make things work. So you make checks for if you're a student taking tests and doing your job and
Yeah.
surviving the dorm. What do you need to know about the world to play that game? Do you need to know the president of your country, the prime minister of your country, and what their stats are? Or do you need to know who is running the local pizzeria? Because you're
Right.
probably going to interact with the pizzeria owner more than you're going to. Uh,
Yeah.
and so I'm not saying that this is bad or wrong, even for its time. I'm asking questions of
Yeah.
myself
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
in terms
yeah.
of that.
I think that in general, you don't want to give monsters stats when they're not meant to be fought.
Mhm.
And you want to simply just create situations that separate that possibility rather than relying on some stat block giving you protection because it never does. Not for long
Yeah.
enough. There's always some trick, right? Push them over the huge cliff, anything like that. And you don't want players bringing in math logic into stories at that level, right? When you're talking about the rulers of a region, the gods, rulers, they should transcend that from a story perspective, unless you want it not to, in which case then you stat them out for that one time. But
Mhm.
yeah, no, I wouldn't do this. I think it's interesting to provide some indication of who they are, but that there are many ways to achieve that aren't just saying rogue.
Yep.
Yeah.
The government of Alyssa is a feudal empire with hereditary rulership, and the capital is Calstrand, and we get major towns. We get several given along with their population. And then, as Teos mentioned earlier, we get into the provinces of this. And we get eight principalities, including one major one and various smaller fiefdoms. So that's in the provinces section, it just names them. Later, it will actually, in the history uh, section, we actually get, you know, talk about each.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, where are we? We are at
Resources.
resources. There are 13 things listed, including fine ale and beer and historical and magical knowledge. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, this is right. That's the lens of I think Gygax, where I think he's coming from a time when we broke down our actual world this way, right? Like,
Mhm.
and it's why people today still are like, well, we create steel, and no, we don't, and it's arguable to what extent. Well, yeah, I'm not going to get into that, but like to what
Yeah.
extent you want to break down countries by things like this. But we did that, right? We did that for our real world, and sometimes still do, and and so it's viewed as important in this sort of clashing of nations that is taking place.
Mhm. The coinage, we get the nightingale, the platinum piece, the crown is the gold piece, the noble is the electrum, the penny is a silver piece, and the common is a copper piece.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about this earlier, how good information to have if you want to get deep into a role-playing situation. I'm I want to know what percentage of players or game
Yeah.
masters and players find this information useful, think they find this information useful, and then actually use that information when they're playing at the table.
I
Uh,
mean, yeah, like even I was looking at like Jeff, and I couldn't remember what we called the coin in our region in Living Greyhawk, but I do looking at the names. I'm like, oh yeah, we would sometimes use those names, right? The copper piece is an owl, but yeah, it's throwaway stuff. It's fine, but boy, it takes up space, and it's yeah,
Mhm.
not the important part.
Yeah. The population breakdown, 79% human, and they do this thing where they have an initial for each race of human, and if it's a dominant population of that race, it will be a capital letter, and if it's a minority, it will be a smaller.
Hmm.
So the O for Iridian and the S for Sewell are capitalized, while the F for Flan is lowercase.
Yeah. And even within elves, right? 5% of elves, Sylvan, 90%, right? It's so interesting, the view of what was important back then. And yeah.
Languages, we get Common, Old Oridian, Orc, Halfling, and Elven. Uh, Showing again that sort of reflects the population with an orc contingent that was hired as mercenaries for the armies, so they are still uh, a significant portion of the population there. Alignments, we literally get 7 alignments listed
No chaotic
with an
good.
asterisk. Yeah, nobody apparently is chaotic good there, except just all the player characters.
Mm-hmm.
And LE gets an asterisk to show that the government is lawful evil, which means they follow the laws and the laws are in place to protect the wealthy and the powerful. Boy,
Mm-hmm.
does that sound like any region of our world that we know? Or is it every
Every
region of the
region.
world that we know? Uh, what is it? A government is a necessary evil. That's it.
Oh, yeah.
Um, Religions, there are 20 listed. And part of
Jeez.
those 20 are whole pantheons.
Yeah.
So you'll get individual gods, but then it will say the Orc pantheon, which is in itself several gods, or the Elven pantheon,
Yeah.
which is in itself is several gods.
Yeah, and this is the
Um,
kind of thing where if you super know the Greyhawk lore, knowing that Zilchus is state sanctioned, it gets an asterisk, and that Hextor, those are the first 2 named. Well, that
yeah.
has a very, then now you're getting what these people are like here when Hextor is your number 2 god and Zilchus your number 1. And then it's Aurelian agricultural gods, and then Zerbo and Farlangan, and you get down the list. But but if you don't know, well, these are just random names. And what does this tell you, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
And are you really supposed to know all of these 20 that are listed, right? Oh, good luck.
Yeah. Yeah. Allies, none. Enemies, all your old favorites, the Scarlet Brotherhood, the Northern Kingdom, and Iuz. And it says Ahlissa is gravely distrusted by everyone else, and the Renee hate it so much that they never travel there. So again, that's interesting to know, but sort of no context to it. I don't know how to, as a game
Yeah.
master, present that. Uh, so for the overview, then, I want to go bullet by bullet for each paragraph, just for this overview section.
Yeah. Just for
And
this one country.
these are not short paragraphs.
No.
These are long paragraphs. Some of the paragraphs are half a column, and a column is about 550 words. So big paragraphs. The first is Ahlissa comprises central and southern lands of the former Great Kingdom. It gives map descriptions like it's the lands between this coast and that river.
Yeah. Which is not always like super clear. Like,
Right.
Ahlissa, they should really just kind of tell you, like, or even have a little minor map would help of where it is. But, it's sort of all the way to the east and south. And so it's out of the central picture that you might often be talking about, right? It's far from Greyhawk, across a whole 2 bays and a sea, right? So it's quite separated from a lot of the lands, and that may not come through in its description.
Yeah, it definitely does not. And there are hundreds of words used to that. This is one of those, a picture being worth 1,000 words. Most definitely here. Second paragraph. It's a paragraph on the population makeup and sort of locations where that population is. Third paragraph, more geography stuff about where the land is. The next is where the power is located. It's in the capital with the Overking, although the priesthood of Zilchus and the Merchants Guild also hold a great deal of power and sort of guide the king with their desires, which is the next paragraph, talking about all these powers supporting the king as long as he sees fit to look to their needs and their goals,
And what
which
are
is to
those?
become an empire yet again.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get a list of the 13 subregions with their capitals, their rulers, and again, their rulers have race, class, and alignment, as well as the noble house to which they belong. And I think there are like 6 noble houses in total, some more powerful than others. That's the overview section. Any thoughts?
It's too much, and it's too much because we now are going to go to the next section.
Yeah, and the next section is history. Approximately 3,000 words divided into 16 paragraphs. Paragraphs, I will say this, the most important punctuation mark you can use is not a period, not a comma, not an exclamation, not a question mark. It's the return key. Because when you, especially nowadays with people's attention spans, including my own, when you look at a column of text and there's no separation, it becomes almost impossible to read. So even using smaller paragraphs will help a reader get through things. And this needs that. And I am not putting down the people that wrote this. I really am not. This is exactly what I would have written in 2000. So I bear no malice, ill will, or hard feelings toward folks. But I've learned lessons since then, and that's what we're trying to do here.
I would have written this 3 times as big in 2000.
Yeah.
I was a monster.
And it's funny because the very first thing is the history of the United Kingdom of Ahlissa is essentially the history of the Great Kingdom. And the previous chapters have talked about the history of the Great Kingdom. And so my question is, why are we about to hear it again? And that's not facetious. Why? Do we need to hear it again because of the way the book is supposed to be used?
Yeah.
Do we expect people to read those first chapters so they already know the Great Kingdom's history? Or do we expect that they're going to just go to Ahlissa because that's what they want to read about? And so it does need to be made again because that's the encyclopedia method of presenting information. And so I don't know if you've read these other sections, so I have to tell you everything again.
Yeah. And I think there's a feeling, and this is true of the Forgotten Realms as well, and other sort of sacred settings, designers feel they must faithfully represent everything and capture it all perfectly because they will be judged by it, right? Did I do a good job? Did you capture all the important information or did you leave something out? So I better capture all the important information. That is a good book. Not, is this super fun for anybody to sit down with and work off of? Right. And those are different goals. And I think these books have often been written from that perspective. Yes, they want to make it fun, no doubt. Right. But there is that sense of I must cover it all. All the truth must be found here. Right. I mean, Ed Greenwood publishing the with what's his name? Brian James. Right. The history, grand history of the realms. Right. But Ed is like, yeah, this is amazing. Right. We of course need this absolutely detailed historical account of every little thing that ever happened, and it must be accurate.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. It shouldn't be the only thing that you present to people who want to run a game, not write a novel, not write comic books, not create video games, because there is something for that. That's called a world Bible.
And in our show notes, you do a great job, I think, in this next section, conflicts and intrigues, of talking about what could be.
Right. So we had 16 paragraphs and 3,000 words about the history, things that have happened. The conflicts and intrigue section is 1 paragraph of about 80 words. The last line, I think, or one of the last lines in this is, a secret society called Midnight Darkness assassinates 4 foreigners in Ahlissa, seen as interfering in Ereidi's noble culture. And I'm thinking, why couldn't I have 16 paragraphs about that? Because that's where I'm running my adventure. The characters need to go there, and suddenly people around them are being assassinated, and they need to investigate, and they need to find out why. That's the adventure I want to run. Tell me about this Midnight Darkness. Give me the level and the alignment of the people that run that,
Yeah.
because that's where my focus needs to be. I
Yeah.
want 80 words of history and 3,000 words of conflicts and intrigues.
And I think the fourth edition version of Forgotten Realms did that. It was not, I think,
Mhm.
a super well regarded book, but it did a good job of distilling things down from the perspective of what's the player need to know in the player book and what's the DM need to know, that they can launch a fun adventure here without that sense of I have to replicate the entire history of Myth Draenor in infinite detail, right?
Yeah. And then I stepped back at this point, Teos, and I said, this book, this Living Greyhawk Gazetteer, does what it needed to do, because it wasn't for game masters.
Mm-hmm.
It was for triads
Yes.
to build campaign guides for their own regions.
Yes. Totally.
And so all of this that we're saying needs to be taken with a grain of salt, because this information was put together not for you, game master at home. It was put together for people who would be creating an Ahlissa got campaign guide for adventure writers and game masters and players to live within that world and that world only, that region, that specific place.
I think all settings are guilty of this. I think the
Mhm.
Tal'Darai guide is, an attempt to make sure that we've written down everything that is in, Matt's head.
Yeah.
And I think probably the same is true of, if we were to get an MCDM setting, it would probably be like,
Mhm.
well, we need to write down all these things that are in his head so that we
Yeah.
have a full accounting, right? So that fans can get all the truth. And that's
Mhm.
that's where the creators come from and companies come from, because they feel this need to establish that. For Living Greyhawk, it was super useful because yes, what it meant was
Mhm.
you could take little bits like the name of your coin and breathe life into it, right? And have that be fun parts of adventures and interactions. You could take not just this obvious midnight death squad assassin thing that's going on, but all those little bits and the names of the Baradies, and you can flesh that, right? All these things are great bones and meat upon which you could expand your experience to make for really, really cool adventures there. And so it made the regions in Living Greyhawk immediately deep or easily deep, and which is a great gift, right? But yeah, for a DM,
Mhm. Yeah.
mm-hmm.
And this is all the more fascinating to me because early in 2024, I was literally working on 5 different projects that involved world building of some kind.
Mm.
Some
Wow.
of them were world building just like this. We're going to make a campaign guide. We need to describe it. Some of it was building a world through adventures.
Mm.
So everything that went into the adventure needed to work as an adventure, but also needed to illuminate the world.
Yeah.
Some of it was through fiction, like Surviving Strange Hollow, where I was reading or writing people's fiction that was meant to build the world. And it all,
Mm.
the process was very, very different for each of those things, but it was all working toward that same goal of making something where people could run a fun game that met the needs of their players and themselves.
Yeah.
And so it's so hard to do it right,
Totally.
but it's very easy to do it wrong. And it's something that I grapple with, if you can't
Oh
tell.
yeah.
I'm even
Yeah.
grappling with it right now.
Yeah. It is really fascinating because it's so hard to lose those goals you naturally want as a publisher or a designer, and to imagine what the player wants. This is one of these things where you could argue, why do I have 40 regions?
Mhm.
Why don't I just have 2?
Mhm.
And give you some great actionable work off of that, and then just describe in very rough places others. But everything happens here.
Yeah.
Shadow the Demon Lord kind of does that a bit, right? Where it just sort of says,
Mhm.
like, I'm not going to go too deep on the setting, and I'm going to mostly tell you about these kinds of places, but you go off and do your thing. Um,
Mhm.
But it's tough. I mean, D&D clearly has loved pillaging Greyhawk's history and using it all kinds of products, right? All of the NPCs and so on, and the adventures, Lost Caverns of Sojkanth or anything,
Mhm.
White Plume Mountain, it all gets just shoved
Monsters.
back into the right.
Yeah.
And boy, it's even made it into Narath, right? With the Conquest of Narath board game. Welcome to the Temple of Amal Evil. Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Princes of the Apocalypse shows up in Forgotten Realms. It's just, it all gets stripped for parts, and yet D&D feels that need to assert this historical truth around settings,
Mhm.
and yeah, there's a real art to
Yeah.
getting both somehow achieved at enough of a level.
Yeah.
I wonder,
So,
Shawn,
oh, go ahead.
I wonder whether we should try to quickly talk a bit about another region to provide a contrast and then pause there.
Sure.
I don't. What do you think?
Yep. Yep. That's fine. Which region did you want to talk about?
We could
Bandit
just go
Kingdoms?
down to Bandit Kingdoms. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. So the Bandit Kingdoms, as opposed to Alyssa, which is sort of ruled by this noble house driven regional area, the Bandit Kingdom is ruled by petty warlords, tyrants, lesser Boneheart mages, which are mages who are dedicated to Ayuz. Because Ayuz has this empire, and the Bandit Kingdoms are a part of that.
Yeah. So Bandit Kingdoms is kind of middle upper of the map. Ayuz is to the west. And then things like the Pale, there's a forest to the north, the Pale is to the east, Shieldlands to the south, and there's this enormous canyon there, right? That gives a lot of the color to this region. And the Bandit Kingdoms, well, yeah, we'll get into the history, but yeah, just that's where it is geographically, which I think is very helpful to understand.
Yep. And so this is now given to us. Again, we get the history of Ayuz and what this place was, what this place became. Then the Horned Society moved in, and then right, Ayuz sort of he and his minions oversee it. Some of the bandits ally with Ayuz, but they don't really ally with Ayuz. They try to use Ayuz's power to get their power for themselves.
Yeah, because
Uh,
historically, this is a ragtag bunch of bandits, but nefarious characters who are stabbing each other in the back whenever they get a chance, and kind of scrapping, scraps of power kind of thing across this rough, dry region. And then Ayush shows up and goes, you will fall in line. They're like, yeah, we'll fall in line because you're the biggest, most evil thing that could dent my head. And if I can, I'll stab you in the back, like I've always done with
right.
everybody else. And maybe I even
Exactly.
have to join with some of my former enemies to oppose you. And by the way, we're really good at subterfuge and stabbing people in the back, so they slowly start to kind of resist in interesting
Right.
ways.
And
While
this
being
rift
nefarious.
is here that we can hide in.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes it even harder to root out things. But there are subregions. So we get the detail of 16 subregions, as well as the people who are sort of in power or have just fallen out of power or
Mm-hmm.
who are about to come to power. Um, and one of the example regions is Barony of Wormhole. And I just pick it because it was one of the last ones. It's essentially an abandoned barony ruled by some unknown forces that are allied with Ayuz. So all the history we get about it is really quite irrelevant, right? It all begins to sound the same.
Yeah.
It's either, and to step back even further, this, while it's different from Alyssa, is sort of the same, right?
Mm.
You have this person who rules, but they are at the whim of some other force, right? So there is an overking, but he's sort of put into place by Zilchus and the merchants. Ayuz sort of rules over this place through proxies, but there are these subregions that are always bickering or fighting each other for power. And I feel like the history, it's like every story can be told in one of two ways: the hero's quest or a stranger comes to town.
Uh-huh.
And it's like that with history in general, right? It's like there was power, and then the power went away, and then the power
I,
came back, and then the power went
I
away.
think I think that's all because they are the writers, and it's true of Gygax way back when he penned it, are caught up in letting you know that, Bob, son of Joe, mother of blah, is the person who did X. And they get
Mhm.
caught up in so much that it ends up feeling all the same, right? Because everybody had a mother and a father, and especially in this case, the father is emphasized. And we go through this list of what they did, and like this sort of family
Mhm.
whatever stuff that is outside of what's really cool. Like the cool things are things like for Rookroast, where it talks about the myth that the city on the hill will never be taken as long as the ravens in Rookroast remain alive, and that so far that's been true. That's the cool stuff. But they get
Yeah.
lost in it because they got to tell you about how the ruler is the robber baron Latavius who did this and da da da, and this happened and the other. And what
Yeah.
was fun
And
about
so,
Living Greyhawk was folks who are triad members
right.
breathed life into this, right? And I was
Sure.
fortunate to travel to the Bandit Kingdoms a fair bit. And going to the Bandit Kingdoms was a total cultural experience where you went from, say, Jeff, which was, yeah, let's save the land, work in concert with it. And when an NPC meets you, they're good and you're going to do what they want you to do and you're going to hand over the artifact. And you go play here, and they might take that artifact that somebody wanted, and A, the person hiring you is probably evil, but B, you might just want to steal from them anyway, and you probably will give the artifact to the evil person at the end.
Mhm.
Totally different, right? And that
Yeah.
was because people so breathe life. And one of the folks that I met with and gamed with there was Casey Brown, and he wrote the unofficial Living Greyhawk Bandit Kingdoms summary, which is an incredible resource and example of the passion and storytelling of the campaign. So you can go on drive through and you can buy a full account of all the story that took place for this region of the Bandit Kingdoms and how these words that are sometimes so lacking became
Mhm.
major experiences as they dealt with the Thieves Guild and Rookroast and dealt with the Boneheart and Stoink and moved to, throughout all these areas, right? And breathed life into the barony of Wormhall and made it much more than this
Yeah.
dry write up. And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I read that Barry of Rohan, like, yes, I want a whole campaign
Mm-hmm.
where it's who's in charge of this barony. People are ready to move back in. It says in the book that this barony is ripe to be liberated, and Ayuz couldn't do anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, okay, there you go. There's your. So
Yeah.
tell me, what is this barony? What is this place where these mysterious people? Who are these mysterious people?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
I
Help me
I
tell the
want
story, right? Like,
I want to tell
mhm.
this story. Please help me. Please help
Yeah.
me tell this story.
Yeah. Sometimes the mysteries in this book feel like they are mysteries they don't want to reveal because maybe they'll be
Mhm.
in a book or something like that. And that's, I think, also a
Yeah.
problem of many settings where, Ed Greenwood doesn't want you to know exactly how the mythals work. And Ed
Mhm.
Greenwood doesn't want to know who did the thing. And it's like, you're not in charge. The DM is.
Right.
Each individual
Yeah.
DM gets to this, of course you
But
still
in this
can.
case, if this is written for the people who would be running the Living Forgotten Realms
Then
campaign,
it makes a bit more
then
sense.
it's okay to
Mm-hmm.
make that mysterious. Uh,
Yeah.
and as it said right at the beginning, you don't have to believe everything you read here. And
Yeah.
one last story, which is sort of humorous because they also published Living Greyhawk journals, which were little magazines
Right.
that went through different aspects of the campaign and reported news about the campaign. But it also had articles that you might read in like Dungeon or Dragon. And so being in Keoland, I was brought on after the campaign had started to handle the adventure writing. And I got this document that the previous triad members had put together about what stories were going to be told and what would be true in Keoland. So I was working from that. But the first issue, there was an issue 0, but in issue 1 of the Living Greyhawk Journal, there was this huge write-up about Keoland by somebody who was not on the triad that contradicted certain elements of this story Bible that I had received from the other triad members that we were going to use. So right then, this mystery of what could we do here, which we had answered and we're going to show through adventures, then changed because a higher authority
Yeah.
decided to take our region and say what was in it.
I mean, my favorite, it's a different type of example, but there was a fan who showed up on the Yahoo group saying that he did not like the stories that were in the Living Jeff region and that they would now share their awesome storyline, which by virtue of sharing it meant it couldn't be used even if you'd liked it. But what it involved was the Jeff Navy. We are a landlocked nation, by the way.
A landlocked nation,
A
yeah.
landlocked nation, and his story arcs were all about the Navy of Jeff, and he was very serious and clearly shared this with the full knowledge that this is the best campaign one could ever have. And boy, the reception was not warm.
Especially coming from Jeff, which was one of the best regions.
Very invested
thanks
folks.
to one Eric Mengi.
But that just shows you how all
others.
kinds of people have different takes, on what you can do with something, including your Navy for your landlocked nation. So,
So that was a look at just two of the regions. What we'll do next time is go through each region, but not go as in depth because we've already made our points.
We'll
talk about we'll talk about the little things, the cool things, the strange things of the regions of Greyhawk. So thank you for out there listening. We appreciate everything that you do for us, for just listening to our voices. We thank you. If you are one of our patrons, we thank you even more by giving you shout outs. So thank you, Master of Dungeon supporters. The Master of Realm supporters get a shout out in our show notes. And the Masters of the Multiverse, well, you hear their names right now. People like Keith Ammon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Lou Anders of Lazy Wolf Studios, Craig Bailey, David Bastiensen, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Calvin Bridges Avalos, Evil John, Will Doyle, Andy Edmonds at nerdronomicon.com, The Mighty Jerd, James Fisher, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Brian King, Jim Klingler, a.k.a. DM Prime Mover, Chad Lynch, Paul Mata, The Mathemagician, Eric Mengi, Trey McLemore, John Mickey, Sean Molly, Falcon Neal, Tom Nelson, creator of The Deck of Player Safety, Mike Olson, Mighty Zeus, Post-Fiction RPG Audio, Robert Pasley, Vladimir Prenner from Croatia, Pugnus, Ozymandias Rex, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Ross Sandberg, Andy Shockney, Krishna Samose, Josh and Loanika of the Tabletop Journeys podcast. I'm going to pronounce that name wrong every single time. That is the new Krishna. Jeremy Talaman from the D&D and TV podcast, Trace, Joe Tyler, Marcelo de Velasquez, the Valiant DM, James Walton, Graham Ward, Jason Ward from Accidental Sly Cops Games, creators of Surviving Strange Hollow, Javier Wozniak, Chris Webster, Walt Winfrey. Thank you all so much. You can go to patreon.com/masteringdnd if you would like to join the Patreon or become a backer. If you get a chance, you can also help us out by going to Apple Podcast or going to wherever you listen to the podcast and giving us a review, or go to YouTube and you can see our beautiful faces and you can like and subscribe and do all that jazz. Teos, where are you and what are you up to?
I'm on alphastream.org. I did too much over the weekend, so I haven't yet done part 2 of the video on creating campaigns, but that'll be out soon. And when it comes out, it'll be through alphastream.org.
You can find me on all the socials at Shawn Merwin, SHAWN MERWIN, and at Mastering D&D is also out there on most of the socials. You can also go to Patreon, ask us questions. If you join us, we'll give you a link to our Discord where some great conversations take place. We also answer folks on the YouTube channel. We're on YouTube at youtube.com/@masteringdungeons. So we've just started our little trek through the regions of Greyhawk. What are we going to do now?
I'm going to fix the big omission for the Ahlissa grouping, which is that they did not tell us the super cool erotic fanfic that should happen between the painter and the Overking of Ahlissa. So I'm going to fix that.
Yeah. Well, I'm already packing up to head to the Bandit Kingdoms because I want to see what's going on in the Barony of Wormhall. Mm.
All the worms.
All the worms, tasty protein.